My 8-year-old daughter broke her teacher's arm, and the school board gave her an award. The principal's voice on the phone was shaking when she told me there'd been an incident. Mrs. Ashford said I needed to come to Oakmont Elementary immediately, that my daughter Harper had injured her teacher and an ambulance was on the way. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car, my mind racing through possibilities that made no sense. Harper was 8 years old, barely 60 pounds, the kind of kid who cried when she accidentally stepped on ants. She'd never been in a fight, never shown aggression, spent most of her time reading books about animals and drawing elaborate fantasy worlds in her notebooks. Whatever had happened couldn't possibly involve her breaking someone's arm. The school parking lot had 2 police cars and an ambulance when I arrived. Parents were clustered near the entrance, phones out, filming or calling other parents to spread whatever gossip they'd gathered. I pushed through them and found Mrs. Ashford waiting inside with Officer Denise Morton, who I recognized from the school resource program. The principal looked pale and kept wringing her hands. Officer Morton's expression was harder to read, something between concern and what might have been approval. They led me to the nurse's office where Harper sat on the examination table with a blanket around her shoulders. Her face was blotchy from crying and her hands were shaking. When she saw me, she burst into fresh tears and I pulled her into my arms, checking her for injuries. She had red marks on both wrists and a bruise forming on her upper arm. Her shirt was torn at the collar. I asked what happened and she just shook her head and pressed her face against my shoulder. Mrs. Ashford cleared her throat and explained that Harper's 3rd grade teacher, Mr. Leonard Priest, was being transported to County Medical with what paramedics believed was a broken radius and possible nerve damage. That Harper had somehow caused the injury during what Priest was calling an unprovoked attack in the classroom. I pulled back to look at Harper's face and asked if that was true. She nodded and whispered that she'd hurt Mr. Priest, that she'd twisted his arm and heard it crack, that she was sorry but she'd had to do it. Her voice broke on those last words and I felt my stomach drop. Officer Morton asked if we could speak privately and led me into the hallway while the nurse stayed with Harper. Morton pulled out her notebook and explained that according to other students, Harper had grabbed Priest's arm during a confrontation and applied some kind of joint lock that resulted in the fracture. Multiple witnesses confirmed Harper had initiated the physical contact. Priest was threatening to press assault charges against an 8-year-old child. Morton's voice was carefully neutral as she relayed this information, but I caught something underneath. She asked me directly if Harper had any martial arts training or if I'd taught her self-defense techniques. I said no, that Harper took piano lessons and art classes, but nothing physical. Morton made a note and said she'd need to interview Harper formally once her parents were present. I told her I was Harper's only parent, that her father had died in a construction accident when she was 3. Morton's expression softened slightly, and she said she'd try to make the interview as gentle as possible. But that Priest was insisting on pressing charges, and the department had to follow protocol. Back in the nurse's office, I sat beside Harper and asked her quietly to tell me what happened. She looked at me with those big dark eyes so much like her father's, and said Mr. Priest had been hurting her, that he'd been doing it for weeks, and she'd finally made him stop. My blood went cold. I asked what she meant by hurting, and she pulled up her sleeve to show me more bruises I hadn't noticed before, finger marks on her forearm. She said Mr. Priest grabbed her during class when she made mistakes, that he'd pull her to the front of the room by her arm and make her stand there while he pointed out her errors to the other students. That morning, he'd grabbed her so hard she thought her arm would break, and something inside her had snapped. She'd remembered something from a YouTube video about self-defense she'd watched months ago. She'd grabbed his wrist with both hands and twisted as hard as she could while stepping back. She'd heard the crack, and he'd screamed and fallen to his knees. Then she'd run to the corner of the classroom and waited for the other teacher to arrive. I felt rage building in my chest, but kept my voice calm as I asked why she hadn't told me Priest was hurting her. Harper said she'd tried, but I'd been so busy with work and she hadn't wanted to bother me. That Priest had told her and the other students that complaining about teachers would get them in trouble. That parents always believed teachers over kids. I thought about the past 2 months, about how I'd been pulling overtime at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, about coming home exhausted and asking Harper generic questions about school that she'd answered with generic responses, about failing to notice my daughter was being abused right under my nose. Mrs. Ashford returned with a woman I didn't recognize, introducing her as Dr. Beverly Kim from Child Protective Services. Dr. Kim had kind eyes but a no-nonsense manner as she asked to examine Harper's injuries. I stayed in the room while Dr. Kim documented every bruise, every finger mark, taking photographs with a professional camera and making detailed notes. She asked Harper gentle questions about when the injuries occurred and how they'd happened, and Harper's response made my stomach drop. To see the full story, click the link below or go on my channel.